finally sat down and I said, I think I'm going to tell. How come the medical schools don't teach this?
Dr. T. Colin Campbell, Professor Emeritus of Nutritional Biochemistry at Cornell University.
If we do it right, if we eat the right food, we get away from drugs, we can be healthy.
Campbell has given more than 600 public lectures, written over 300 research papers, and been featured in several documentary films.
I've written a book with my son, The China Study.
How have you continued to persevere in the face of so much malicious actors in pursuing this truth?
What's going on behind the scenes, behind the curtain, if you will, is stuff that the public almost never gets to see. You can tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. There's some folks who are just trying to solve problems so they can make some money. But what they don't offer is the most important thing. They don't offer the idea of what we can do to stay healthy in the first place.
So, Dr. Campbell, it is such an honor to sit down with you. I went plant-based after a cancer scare in college. I read the China Study. I went plant-based after reading that, and that was 9 years ago. And now to be able to sit down here and have this conversation with you, it's truly an honor. So thank you so much for your time. Really looking forward to this conversation.
Good.
So you coined the term plant-based in the 1970s, and since then you've been a leader in the field of plant-based nutrition now for decades. But you began your career with a much different perspective on nutrition. And in fact, your doctoral dissertation was all based on promoting the consumption of animal products. So could you share that journey from promoting meat and other animal products to becoming a leader in the plant-based field?
Well, it actually started within miles of here, believe it or not. I was raised on a dairy farm up just on the other side of Leesburg. And so I was milking cows. That's what we did. And I actually traveled from there to Washington 5 years, over 100 miles a day driving to high school.
Wow.
To be able to go to a good school was free. My dad only had a couple years education, so he was a farmer, and I was very close to my dad. And so in any case, he really pushed an education. So I went there, and then went off eventually to go to Cornell to do graduate work and stuff like that. My graduate thesis at that time was on promoting consumption of more animal protein. I mean, that's my background. That's why I tell you where I came from. I mean, that was the thing. Everybody believed that was important, obviously. I did too. And so I did that, and then went away to Virginia Tech shortly after that. There I was put in charge of a project in the Philippines, supported by the State Department, to feed malnourished children. And there is what I come to learn, partly from my medical colleagues, but also from what I could see with the children. The malnourished children, obviously it was a very sad situation to see that sort of thing, but on the other hand, there were a few children that were better. They were more likely to get liver cancer. Very odd. I mean, totally strange. And who would have ever thought that? And they were the ones consuming the most protein, like Western countries. So, and on the other hand, in that program, we were sort of responsible to make sure in those kind of programs that kids get enough protein. That usually meant high-quality animal protein, if you will. In any case, that was a conundrum, to say the least. So I came back from the Philippines, and I had a laboratory at Virginia Tech at the time in cancer and diet. And so I appealed for some funding just to look at that question. Is it true that more animal protein, the few kids were consuming the Western country diet, is it true that it has any relationship to liver cancer? Well, at the same time, there was a study in India, too, with animals, experimental animals, that basically was showing the same thing. Animals, are programmed to get liver cancer. If they're fed more protein, animal protein, they got cancer. And it was dramatic, like 100% to 0%. I mean, I couldn't imagine anything more striking than that, especially in science, those kind of results. So I came back to Virginia Tech, and organized a study for ourselves to see if that's true. I mean, do we give these kids more protein, animal protein or not? And what I learned over the first, maybe 4 or 5 years, it was spectacular. We could get to the point where the cancer would only grow when it's fed animal protein. If we drop the animal protein down to just below requirement or replace it with plant protein, the cancer was turned off. Turned off, turned on, turned off. And at that point in time, I'm quite frankly, I was quite doubtful in the beginning this was true. So I'm struggling with my own sort of biases in my background. But then, we could turn it on and turn it off. And then I had students, graduate students, who would be working on a doctoral thesis, and so we started doing things like, what's the mechanism? How can this be true? Because I was warned, don't go down that track. It can't be true. And even my colleagues in India, who had shown something similar to this kind of a small study, they had dropped it. They didn't want to go down that road. So I was always told, don't be questioning animal protein like that. And being in that camp, by the way, I tended to believe it. But nonetheless, there was the results. So we kept doing it, and finally we could turn cancer on and turn it off. And we, as I said, we wanted to find out what the biochemical mechanism is. That usually involved a thesis of maybe 2 or 3 years of a graduate student, looking at one thing to see what effect this protein would have in the tissue. We learned, for example, that feeding more protein, more of the carcinogen that starts cancer, more of the carcinogen would go into the cell faster. That was kind of interesting to say, oh, that's the answer. You see, the reason that this is really important because in science, in this area of science at least, when you see something really odd, you obviously establish whether it's true or not. But then if you do, the next thing to do, prove how it works. That's key. We call that by the term biological plausibility. And so we got the first mechanism. I said, oh, that's it. And the reason we do that, then maybe you can get a drug. That's the way the pharmaceutical companies work. You get a drug to block it, and you keep on eating what you want to eat. So we did the first one. Another student comes along, just for the sake of doing his research, I had him look at another mechanism, a different kind of mechanism, had to do with the enzyme in the cell. So in that case, the animal protein elevated the enzyme to activate the carcinogen. That's 2. What's going on here? And we kept asking these kind of questions as we go along. Finally, after about 12 years or so, I had a number of students sort of checking out one mechanism. I finally got to a point in my mind that there's no, which mechanism here is working? Do I just pick out one? And what I finally came to the conclusion after some years, there's something very different about this whole system. Nutrition is not about one nutrient doing one thing. What we found was when a nutrient is being consumed in the form of food, everything, if that nutrient is not good, and all the other nutrients around it in that food, everything goes wrong at the same time. And the response is very active. It will change in a matter of nanoseconds after you eat the food. So it was a whole different dynamic than what exists in science. You don't just take one thing and see what effect it has. Like drugs, for example. When you're eating food and it's the right kind, everything just kind of swims along together. I call it Mother Nature. She knows what she's doing. And, when we eat food, there's a whole lot of things come in with it, all kinds of nutrients. It's just absolutely amazing that something is going on here, that everything is just kind of working. Some things would elevate in activity, some things would decrease, but all of them at the same time ended up in the same place. That's still an idea, incidentally. It's quite controversial, I have to say, but nonetheless, that's the way it works. So I got into a whole different world of what nutrition was about. And that happened over a period of years, but I'm just saying to go back to the beginning. Those results in the rats at that time were so dramatic. And I had to know. Do we feed these kids high protein or high animal protein? That's where it really started.
So I am just astounded by the fact that all we really need to do for our bodies is provide the right nutrition, get sleep, get some exercise, hydrate our bodies. I'm amazed that we have a few very simple inputs that we need to give our bodies, and our bodies will do all of the rest. Incredibly complex things. I'm just astounded by the kind of incredible nature of our bodies. What does the field of biology mean to you after you've gone through your career?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it really is. I was also astounded, too, to even come to this sort of conclusion. It changes everything, the way we think. And that for the most part, not 100% all the time, but for the most part, if we're eating the right kind of food, it turns out it's working to actually repress cancer development, heart disease, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, on and on. I mean, if you think about it, when we're eating food, nature wouldn't have it so that kind of food, if it's doing something good here, that it would do something bad elsewhere. It doesn't work that way. It makes no sense. So that's what we basically were establishing, is that this is a kind of almost like a grand plan. It's all working together. And that, in turn, is very challenging for the kind of system we have in medicine. Because medicine is basically founded on the idea that if we get sick, we got problems, all we need to do is work out, what's the mechanism for whatever that is, and then develop a drug, take the drug. And that's, unfortunately, the system we have.
Yeah, and that's not how the body works.
That's not how it works.
So the New York Times published a story on your China study research in May 1990 and called your work the Grand Prix of epidemiology. So most people in that position would be over the moon about getting published in the New York Times, but you were actually kind of worried because you thought this article might sink your career. How did the book, The China Study, come to be, and what was that process from your perspective?
Well, that actually started back in the early 1980s, after Nixon went to China to establish relationships again. In fact, I was likely to be on his team. That was 1972. I was in the Philippines at the time, and I heard when I would go through Japan and Hong Kong and then Philippines. When I got to Hong Kong, I heard Nixon was going to come to China. It was a surprise, big news. And I went to the consulate for the Chinese Communist government in Hong Kong. Hong Kong, you see, was kind of independent in those days. They have their own entity. I went down to the consulate to ask if there's any possibility I might, go to Red China. And and then I had to go to the Philippines first. I just left a question. My friend I had brought along in Hong Kong, he was going to come with me to the Philippines too. And in any case, the next day I went down to Manila. And that's when I learned my dad had passed away. So I didn't go. But he, in turn, told me that after I left, I got a phone call that the Chinese government had called and said, yes, we'd like to have you. So I missed that opportunity of being with Nixon. But so I got really kind of interested in China. And then in 1980, when the U.S. and China were starting to send delegations back and forth, one of the key delegations that came to this country, about 7 or 8, I guess it was, they came to a university in New York, and then one of them, who was the #1 guy in all of China probably in the area of cancer research, he came down to Cornell because he wanted to visit with me. And so when we were there, I heard that they had this mammoth study of like 800,000 people who died, what they died of. It was a big atlas and all that. And so it got very exciting, and I said, well, why don't we? It was a perfect setting to go to China to see why is cancer here, very high here and very low elsewhere. And the whole atlas was all laid out so that these different diseases would tend to pretty much concentrate in different geographic areas. So I thought it was a really good idea. to go to China if we could. The U.S. and China didn't have any relations at that time to set up a study. So why don't we just organize a big survey? Measure all kinds of things, take blood samples, urine samples, food samples, so forth and so on, and see what we could see, if we could account for the reason why cancer is high in one place and not another. And so eventually we got the study, and I had a team with me, the cancer researcher in China, this Dr. Chen, a fantastic guy. I mean, the Chinese had a really, what they called barefoot doctors kind of operation. They had, health workers all over the country and stuff like that. And they were really well organized. And so I also got a friend from Oxford University who was an epidemiologist, a statistician type of person. Very well known, he's well renowned. So I went to see him, and so he and I and a third person who was the director of the whole atlas got together and formed a team. And the reason I also wanted to do that was because, not only because it's a good opportunity to see, why cancer existed here and not there kind of thing, but it was an opportunity for me to see if what I was learning in the laboratory existed in humans. I mean, we were getting spectacular data in the laboratory. It was very exciting. But, it's hard. Most people, it's hard to believe. They don't say, well, that's experimental animals, that's this, that's something else. But in China was a perfect setting. So we did that study. And then that was in 1983, 84. And then we spent from 83, 84 until 1990 analyzing mountains of data, mostly in Oxford. And then finally we wrote it up, and I got interviewed by a New York Times reporter, and that's what ended up in the New York Times. So they were the ones that decided that this was a Grand Prix, as they say, of all studies. But it was an opportunity for me as a scientist. I've been working in the lab. I'm learning how things, work in some detail. It was hard to believe. But then to go to a human population and see the same thing. But, with a different approach to the data. And so that combination of laboratory, human study, if you will, done different ways, getting more or less the same result, it's hard to describe it. And that was amazing. Because all these different diseases, about a dozen different cancers, for example, they all more or less respond to the same thing. All kind of occurring or not occurring, pretty much as a function of nutrition. And on the question concerning nutrition, in those kind of studies, you can't conclude exactly what's causing what necessarily, but you can certainly look at trends and correlations and stuff like that and start pulling it all together. And that was really exciting. So in the meanwhile, I'm also very much involved in Washington, in national policy development and seeing what makes for policy, seeing, how does our population get to know this or that or something else. And so I had kind of on one hand, I had the evidence from the laboratory, and on the other hand, the evidence in the human study in China, plus lots of other studies that were going on. You could pull them in. So when you sit down and start looking at this, and you see that they're so similar, kind of across the board, and a lot of this we've known for upwards of 100 years. And it never really came out to the public to know this, to the extent that any of this they didn't have access to the kind of information I had, because they would tend to work a little bit here, a little bit there. And so we survived for, 100 years, almost on this idea, this concept, that disease occurs because of something specific we do wrong. We treat it by something very specific, a drug, if you will. And the whole idea of nutrition playing a game in there, playing a part in that, kind of got squashed and pushed to the background, because nutrition doesn't make money. In that case, all you need to do is tell the people, here's how it works. So it turned out to be a leaning toward the plant-based diet idea, and that didn't go over too well, because the idea of consuming animal protein was paramount. We have to have protein. We call it high quality. That went on for years and years. I mean, I knew coming from the farm. right near here where we're sitting. And so then I did my doctoral dissertation. I know the game that happened, that we eat that kind of food, we get healthy and big and strong, et cetera, and forget about, what human health is really about. So for me, it was a very exciting proposition. You got the human stuff, you got the experimental animal stuff, you got biochemistry, all this kind of thing. I'm in Washington, working a lot there in policy at fairly senior levels. And I could see, my colleagues, really wonderful people, but they didn't have the opportunity to see what I was seeing. And it finally ended up on a National Academy Committee. It was testified before congressional committees and that sort of thing in about 1980. And that's when the stuff hit the fan, because now I'm saying things that are just totally at odds with what our system is all about.
I'd love to get into that in a little bit more detail. I'd love to talk about the importance of being open-minded in the field of research. So the way that you approached the China study was in a really open-minded way, and you had some initial hunches based on your work in the Philippines that there was this link between liver cancer and protein, and you kind of had a bias for consuming animal products even still going into the China study. Now it's about 40 years later, and we still seem to have lots of people in the research and medical fields who do not seem to be that open-minded. How does this change?
Fantastic question. I mean, that's actually exactly what I've become concerned about, I guess, in the last 20, 30 years. To sort of pulling it all together and asking that question, why does the public know this? Well, from a scientific point of view, my understanding, my perception of that whole thing is that we tend to work on one thing at a time. This nutrient does this, and this much of this nutrient, or and this one does this. We're talking about parts instead of the whole. And when you start thinking about it that way, we do that because parts make money. If we can find a part, a new nutrient or a new something else like that, and if we can describe it well enough to get some intellectual property protection so it can be sold, that's the game plan. And people do that, just think that way automatically without realizing, that's a little bit something different. And so it becomes a question concerning, on the one hand, technology, doing all the wonderful things that we think it's doing, if you will, stands in contrast to nature. So it's like technology versus nature. There's another term we use is technology is based on the parts, studying the parts. Reductionism, we call it. Nature is talking about the whole. So it's wholeism. So it's wholeism, reductionism. And you see that kind of play out, that contrast play out in our society in many different ways. So that's exciting.
So when you were starting to research for your book Whole, you were looking for the term wholeism, and it didn't exist, at least not the WH form of wholeism. So you coined the term wholeism with a WHOLE. What is your definition of wholeism?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The W letter in the beginning, I looked at the Oxford Dictionary and the Western Dictionary, and I thought that at least somewhere along the line, that word holism started with an H, that it probably originally meant something about the whole rather than parts. I couldn't find it, so I thought I'll stick the W there in the first place. But that concept has so much meaning. Not just in terms of biology and our bodies, the way it works, and inside of cells. And then you start seeing all the different cells in our body, all the different organs, all the different this, that, and everything else. And all of a sudden you arrive at this sort of new world view. I think, for me at least, it was just like seeing nature displayed right in front of me. And we don't tend to see that in our society because we always want to do our own thing, and everybody has their own. I mean, I can understand that because that's where I came from too. But the idea of thinking all this here working together was beyond comprehension. It was just amazing. And it turns out, of course, as you know, it's whole. That refers to plants, because what we learned about animal protein is all bad. There's no doubt about it. So I had to change my own mind, coming through this pathway. But then in the turn, it wasn't about eating plants in terms of this nutrient or that nutrient or something else. It's the whole thing. And just eat it that way and let it go. And nature will take care of us.
Yeah, it's incredible, the power of nature and what our bodies can do, what nature has done with food to provide us with all the nutrients we need, and in the right forms and in the right quantities that we need within these foods. So I'd love to talk a little bit about the kind of a little bit more about reductionist thinking. You've said before, you've used this metaphor that I think is really powerful, and you've said that you view individual research as threads in a tapestry. And all of the individual threads matter, but we really need to zoom out and appreciate the entire tapestry and understand how all of these threads work together. So with this in mind, does reductionism have any place in the field of biology?
That's a good question. By the way, your knowledge of this area is very good. I appreciate the questions you're asking. You're asking really, really significant questions. In terms of biology, by the way, the holism, looking at the parts, it is important. Let me say that first, especially in the physics world, now in the computer world. I mean, there's no doubt about that. We want to know each part exactly what it does, and so we can manage it, change it, whatever, and make it work for us. It's gotten us to the point now where we're talking about AI, which is, everything started working together. In a sense, that's what I've talked about in biology. So back to your question on biology. I think, people somehow, they're inclined to do, we all do this, but we're inclined to do the things that we just do. It's convenient, it tastes good, whatever. And we think, oh, well, we don't worry about that, especially when we're younger. If something happens to us, it'll fix it. Someone will come along and fix it. That's pretty normal behavior and thinking. Nothing wrong. I mean, you don't blame people for that, but that's the way we think. And then when you come to this particular point in time, it's the word holism, or as opposed to reductionism. Reductionism is the part. Holism is the whole, obviously, the whole plant. On the question concerning what we just asked is there any place for reductionism in science? There is, obviously. I mean, in biology. Because, things do go wrong, even if we're doing everything right. And so there are times when, maybe a chemical, we discover that it's not some vitamin or something, not so much a vitamin, but something's wrong, not quite right. We haven't been doing things right. Under those circumstances, there is a place for drugs. I'm not anti-pharmaceutical. When we're doing anything right and something kind of goes wrong, we know that you can take, if you find out maybe one thing that looks like it's not out of order, you can do that. You can adjust it. So I'm not going to say that there's no place for drugs. I don't take drugs myself, but I can understand why it can work. Surgery, drugs, whatever. So the medical system does have a lot to offer. But what they don't offer is the most important thing. They don't offer the idea of what we can do to stay healthy in the first place. And if we do that, we're not going to have to worry that much about finding a part here and there to make things work. Just do it right in the first place. And I spent the first, as I say, 10, 15 years of my career professionally in two professions, actually. One, pharmacology, the other, nutrition. It was totally coincidental, I guess you could say, that I'm working primarily on the idea that health works by knowing all about all the different parts. So I really got kind of deep into the pharmacological, arena of thinking. That's all about reductionism. I didn't know that word at the time, but then when I see it from the nutritional perspective, here's a nutrient and all the things that go around it causing, creating disease a lot better than those drugs. So I had a chance to see two worlds. And the nutrition won out. Nutrition is so much more superior to the idea of drugs. But then you go to the medical schools, for example. There's not a medical school in the United States, not one, that teaches nutrition. And I've come to the point of view that was almost intentional. Not malicious, but it was intentional, because if you start thinking about food and all the different parts, solving problems, you're ruining the opportunity for business. And so people don't particularly want to do that. And so that idea of selling stuff and making money, that's understandable too. So what I'm talking about is not malice or something like that on the part of people. I'm saying we're all part of the same system. And so I had a chance by looking at a pharmacological kind of concept, reductionism, comparing with the holist concept, which that word hardly existed. But they're very different. And so one of the famous philosophers of years past in Greece, for example, they knew that too. That was Aristotle, who said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I mean, all of a sudden, then you look at Aristotle, you look at Socrates, Plato, and all the rest of those great philosophers in ancient times, when they were the ones starting even the concept of democracy. They were thinking. They were really thinking about this whole concept of people working together, let's solve problems in that sort of way to some extent. So we got drug over the time. We got pulled down, in a sense, over time, of ending up thinking about one thing at a time, especially when we got, the innovation of mechanics, if you will, the physical world. We could start doing things in that way and make some money. And so that's where we got into.
So you touched on this idea that the creation of these fields and the lack of a focus on nutrition was perhaps intentional as a opportunity for business. And not only from my perspective was that intentional, but it's also continually perpetuated, which I think is a massive con. So in the late 1970s, you shared really two enormous groundbreaking ideas. One, you said it's nutrition, not genes, that controls a disease. And number two, you said you can turn off disease with nutrition, which were two really kind of polarizing ideas, even to this day, but certainly in the 1970s. And at that time, you had been nominated for president of this important society, and they actually had petitioned to throw you out of the society as a result of sharing these radical ideas. So could we get into a little bit more detail and talk about the ways that you feel the medical and pharmaceutical industries suppress nutrition information to this day?
Yeah, and for me, I mean, I had my own experiences, and they weren't very pleasant. I was really having opportunities to, work at a fairly senior level with FDA and other organizations, and I was on National Academy panels and that sort of thing, testifying before Congress. That last one, testifying before Congress on a report having to do with diet and cancer. Obviously, when I got in these situations of those kind of testimonies, if you will, I would be asked questions more or less in reference to my own work. And so I would start telling about the protein thing, maybe. I knew that was kind of dangerous, but anyhow, right there it is. I can't walk away from facts. And so animal protein is a problem. Some of the people who knew, well, you're from the farm. You did your thesis on promoting. What are you talking about? But that kind of conversation sometimes occurred, but I said what I said, and I caused some problems for some folks, and then I could tell a number of different stories. I'm telling that sort of the new book, if you will, because the pushback it was represented by individuals, sort of coming at me doing this and that. But on the other hand, they in turn are representing the whole concept, of major industries. I'm thinking of two in particular: the livestock industry and the health industry, especially the pharmacological industry. And that's why I say I was just fortunate. I was in both of those committees at the same time early in my career, and it was just totally incidentally. I didn't know what I was doing, really. It just so happens that I had this opportunity to see the contrast. And I see that contrast all the time. It plays out in government. And then we get into politics, and that's another sad story. Everybody wants to, have their own little corner of information, their own piece of information, and promote it. And so I'm actually almost demoralized with what has become of our society. After seeing, we have the chance now these days to see what we have, compare that with what existed 10, 15, 20, 50, 100 years ago, and seeing how it transformed into where we are now. And I find it really troubling, because now you got lots of interests. Somebody's working on this and somebody's working on that, and they have their own interests. And I say, I can understand all that. But what I can't understand is the failure of us being able to talk to other people, in very different points of view. So I think that's something the future is going to have to wrestle with, your generation.
Definitely. So you touched on this new book that you're working on, and I believe that almost became your second book before Whole. In fact, I think you wrote something like 60 pages, and then you just put it aside and decided to focus on a concept that was a little bit more positive, which became your book Whole. Why have you now decided to share all of this kickback and all of these lies that you have experienced throughout your career? Why do you feel now is the time for that?
Well, the question comes up for me, and I get asked this question a lot too. How come medical schools don't teach this? That's a constant. How come we haven't heard this before? And finally you hear that enough, you start wondering to yourself, well, how come we don't know this? I mean, I was in that path in my own career, and I got the pushback that I got, and what do? I finally sat down and I said, I think I'm going to tell what I've seen. So I'm getting to some detail, a lot of things. And some of those decisions that are being made is really terrible. I mean, it's setting a pattern for the future is just simply nonsense. You may know the concept called synthetic biology. Synthetic biology is a popular. It's getting to be a popular concept. Now it's got some words to wrap around the idea. It's in a sense we've been doing it for a lot, but there's this point of view that our future is going to be, in a way, synthetic. That we'll have medicines for everything. I just this morning read about vaccines now being in plants. Vaccines being in plants, give me a break. What they're looking at is some phenomena that represents a memory of what happens to your body after you eat the plants. But plants work in all kinds of different ways. They affect the hormonal system, they affect the enzymatic systems, they affect even neurological systems, and so forth and so on. And so the mindset of a lot of people is, we'll get a chemical for that. We'll fix it all up so that in the future we'll be walking time bombs, so to say. It's all about chemistry. And chemistry is a great science, but give me a break. We don't need to live that way. And it reckons me back to being on the farm and outdoors all the time in the field. You just really appreciate without knowing it. When you get to know something, it's when you leave it. And you look back. But, I was a hunter. I fished. I trapped fur-bearing animals of all things, but that's what we did. Farm boys did in those days. I milked cows, and you live in that world. I love to farm, and then you come and you just discover this other stuff. So I have an appreciation for that kind of thinking, and now unfortunately, in a sense, I've got appreciation for how we do things wrong, and so I wanted to basically describe in this book one segment of our knowledge that's not well known. That's what's going on behind the scenes. What's going on behind the scenes, behind the curtain, if you will, is stuff that the public almost never gets to see. And some of it is, I have to say, is malicious. There's some folks that are just trying to solve problems so they can make some money. And other people get drug into it because for whatever reason, they really believe that maybe is a solution. So we're faced with this very difficult, in a sense, difficult future until we begin to resolve what is this contrast between the whole and the parts.
You have this focus on pursuing truth, which is something that you attribute to your father as being this early character trait that was instilled in you. How have you continued to persevere in the face of so much scrutiny and malicious actors in pursuing this truth? What has been kind of the driving force behind that for you?
Just one thing in what he said. I mean, as I said, my father only had 2 years of elementary school education, and I was the oldest son. I was close to him, and he wanted me to get an education. In fact, I was supposed to go to high school in Leesburg, nearby, but that was a small school. Only 10% of the people went off to college, and so he wanted me to, if possible, go someplace else, and he didn't have the money, so I had to drive 102 miles a day from where I was down to Georgetown in Washington, and it was really a really good public high school. And so he was so dedicated to my getting an education, and he just watched. Sort of everything I was doing was always, watching over. I mean, he also had a tremendous reputation in Loudoun County for his integrity, and so you can't lose that. You can't lose it. So that's what. You wanted me to get an education, tell the truth, tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. It just doesn't go away.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Do you have an expected publication timeline for your new book? Or
I don't know, as soon as I can. I'm about maybe 70-80% done now. I'm kind of hoping I'll be done by 1st of July.
Okay. And then it will go through the editing process. And
yeah, I've got to share it with some other people because I don't like one side. I don't like criticizing other people by name. What are you going to do? I mean, you see it. And there it happened. And in science, the ones I'm talking about, their names in the literature. And the actions are there. You can see in black and white. So how do you handle that? Do you make up names? I can't make up names. So I'm going to get in trouble, I think, before it's over, more trouble.
I have a deep appreciation for your desire to share this information. I feel like that's an important part of us moving forward and breaking free of all of these lies that we face in the industry. So I think we need more voices like yours to speak up and present that. So I appreciate you doing things like that are uncomfortable for the greater good. So you've said before that you believe the future of medicine is treating disease with nutrition. You've talked about that a little bit here. I think that's a future we'd all love to see, but there seem to be many powerful forces that stand in the way of creating that future. What do you think will be the driving force to create a future where medicine is focused more on nutrition than this reductionist model?
It's starting to happen now. in a sense, because if we look at the data on the chief causes of death, we got a lot of records. We're pretty good at recording that kind of information, and the thought that so many of the diseases that actually kill us before our time are strongly related to nutrition. Number one. People are starting to ask questions. You mean to tell me that if you eat that reverse heart disease, as my friends showed, like yesterday, you mean to tell me that also maybe works for chronic kidney disease? I said, yeah. So, that kind of information is coming out. My good friends, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, Dr. Dean Ornish, they, in about the 1990s, was the time the China study came out in the New York Times. And they were sort of messing around and doing some of that kind of thing too. And so, and they were greeted with, I mean, that wasn't they got their own pushback in a sense too. Not quite the way I did, but nonetheless, they were doing something to reverse heart disease. My God, reverse heart disease, what are you talking about? Kind of thing. So I'm good friends with them, but nonetheless, now that's almost like it's beginning to a point where a lot of people don't know that still. But it's kind of getting out there a little bit. And the idea of turning cancer on and off, like we did in the laboratory too. This effect of nutrition is not just about not getting a disease. It's also about actually capturing it, stop and make it go back to normal health. That's an exciting proposition. Who knows that? You've had experiences yourself. I mean, that really. I mean, who goes to look away from that? That's it, and it's the same formula. It's the same formula, just working at different stages of disease. Now, sometimes diseases can get out of hand. That's maybe too late, but a lot of diseases are really quite amenable. The cancer one has been difficult because cancer, that does make a lot of money. With all the chemotherapy and stuff like that. Well, we've gone through 30 years now. Well, it's already now that's passed, but between 1970 and 2010, at that period of time, that's when the so-called war on cancer started. And now what that meant for the most part is having an opportunity to discover chemicals that might cure cancer. That's what it was said. It was the Nixon administration. And that was, obviously that's appealing to hear such things like that. Well, we went through 30 years, spending billions of dollars making chemicals. They're called cytotoxic chemotherapy. The idea there is that the cancer gradually evolves and develops and takes on its own characteristics, its own lifetime, so to speak. And so the idea is that if we can find a chemical to kill those cancer cells, targeted, it's called targeted drug therapy, that's the way to deal with it. We went through 30 years of that kind of stuff, creating these chemicals to kill cancer cells. That's just chemotherapy. After 30 years, looking back, there's a group of Australian and American scientists at the time. They had access to a huge database of cancer victims over that period of time, what kind of drugs they were taking. And so they had a chance to look at all that data to see if they were working. Weren't working. And so then they turned their attention to something a little bit different. They called it immunotherapy. That's what kind of the popular thing now. I don't think that's going to work either. But they're always looking for a chemical solution to things. And so that's always chemical solution to everything. Rather than just standing back and even hearing the word nutrition. Those people working in that field never taught nutrition. So we have to suffer today looking at the media. Talk about, listen to the scientists, like a recent COVID thing. That's sort of, listen to the scientists. Not one of those people have had training in nutrition. Not one. So their solution is to get your vaccine. And of course I got data to the contrary. And it's the same story as it's existed with heart disease, cancer, and all the rest in years past. They're doing the same thing over again. And so, But then you start asking the question, how come people can't understand this thing about nutrition? And I try to think of it, I say, as best I can in a positive way without getting really upset with the crooks. But I mean, that's really what happens. They're just so resistant to think outside the box. So they don't want to hear it. And so it's going to have to change our mindset of what matters. And it's hard. We get all kinds of discussions on that, on the history of it, on the philosophy of it, and all the rest. But they're all pointing the same thing. We'd rather be ignorant and solve something with a wrench or a hammer. Do it right now. That kind of thing. And stupid. It's stupid.
It angers me, all that stuff you just said, and I've only really been exposed to this over the last 8 or so years, coming up on 9. But it's been over 60 years for you going through this, and I can understand how that must feel in just constantly facing a brick wall when it comes to the medical community and just not wanting to listen to you. And that's really, really a tragedy when 80 to 90% of cancers could be totally prevented or cured from nutrition, and we just turn a blind eye and we focus on these potential chemical solutions to a problem that's rooted in nutrition. It's really tragic.
Yep.
So at the beginning of the pandemic, you mentioned COVID. You published a paper suggesting that what you saw in China had great relevance for COVID-19. And despite nearly 400 publications to your name and being well known in the community, 2 of the best known journals in the world, Nature and Lancet, 2 journals that you have published in before, wouldn't even review your results. They clearly didn't want this information to get out. Why do you think that is?
Well, that's one of the more recent things, of course, that I've seen. It's very, very just annoying. It used to be, it was almost like a religion. In science, you work in and you do your stuff. The whole word science, classical science to me, means something different than what is a popular perception. In other words, it has to do with the fact that as scientists, you're expected to be skeptical. You can ask any question you want. If you see something that is worth investigating, you should be entitled to investigate. That's the job of scientists, especially in academia. And with not knowing what the end is in sight, you simply investigate things. And it's structured in such a way that you hypothesize. We can hypothesize the moon is made out of cheese. That's fair enough. Whatever you want to say. But if you have the time, you got the funding to do it. But of course, you go back in that skepticism, you organize some studies. You get some results. And you do it totally transparently. Anybody can see what you're doing. You don't try to hide things. You're not trying to, okay, I got a secret here and I'm going to find out, how I can solve this or something like this. You do the study in that manner, and then always open to, as I say, criticism, always open to exchange of ideas and stuff like this. And finally, you write it all down when you summarize what you think you forgot. And then you submit it for publication. And it's a very, almost, as I say, it's almost like a sacred kind of, I'm not sure if that's the right word, but it's a very precious concept. And when you submit it, you get reviewed by colleagues, professional colleagues. And the way we do it, we send it in, we always get 2 reviews, sometimes 3 if the 2 are divergent. And then they send it back to the author, and the author has a chance to answer the questions or explain better whatever it is. And then finally it's determined whether or not to publish it. That's peer review. It's just like the legal system. We have, trials, and it's a sort of the same sort of concept. The idea is to discover the truth. That's all. It's all it is. And so we all get reviewed. And in recent times, the one you just referred to, I sent that in 2 leading journals because we had data from China. In our study there, and we did that study twice. A lot of people don't know the second time. The first time was 1983. That's the one that New York Times called the Grand Prix. We went back 6 years later, and we did it again. The second time, it was kind of fun. It was essentially a joint study between mainland China and Taiwan. They're kind of, at odds right now. And that was, I said it was kind of fun to get that going. I think that's the only research project that's going on between those two areas. Now they got more like guns pointed at their heads, but in any case, we got results there. Almost 9,000 people, 8,990 to be exact. We had collected blood samples from them, urine samples, all the rest like we did the first time. And I worked on this thing on the liver cancer, where I started my career with the kids. Liver cancer is a serious kind of virus, disease. It's more potent than the COVID. Something like between 500 and 800,000 people a year die in the world. It's not well known all that much, but it's a virus. It's a virus disease. And so we collected all kinds of information on nutrition in those people. We came out with some results that were absolutely spectacular. People who eating a little animal food, and I have to tell you, very small amounts. On average, it's only about 10% of what we do here. And at that time, it was late 1980s. People consume little animal food. They were the ones that did not form antibodies to the virus. They did not form the antibodies to the virus. And they did not, they did some other things too, but they didn't do that. They got the liver cancer. The virus comes in theory, lands on them, and they got liver cancer and died. The mortality rate is very high. People consuming plants, getting the virus, if you will, they formed antibodies. They did not get liver cancer. And we did some stuff in the lab at that time too, this is the early 90s. With animals, we saw the same thing. The animals in this case, eating more animal protein, it suppressed the mechanisms we naturally have in our bodies to resist the disease. They're called T cells. Now they're subject of billions of hundreds of millions at least dollars being spent right now to try to find this as a solution for the viral disease, looking at T cells, some chemical to find T cells. God, we did that, as I say, now it's 30 years ago. And eating animal protein suppresses T cells. T cells are good things. It's a default mechanism we have in our bodies. And so, all of that. I mean, I know that it feels fairly well that way. We sent it for publication. They wouldn't even send it out for review. That's the key. Now, the journalists can turn back manuscripts or send in and say, it's not in our territory. But not in this case. What I was sending is right smack dab in the middle of their interest. They said, we're not going to look at it. And so you wonder, and then I come to find a little bit later, they're part of the game plan. And they didn't want the public to know. They didn't want the public to know this. And somebody, I can't tell names and stuff like that, but it really blocked it. And so when the virus came along, I didn't believe them because I saw the media, the words they were saying, and I was in that field enough to know how you word things. They were saying things a very sneaky way of, and then you all of a sudden realize over 70% of their budget comes from pharmaceutical industries. They either say it that way or they lose their advertisement. And so when it came along, we're older, my wife and I, of course. We were in our 80s at that time. I didn't want to get the vaccine because I did not believe it would work. I can't be 100% certain on anything. You can't do that. But the odds, as far as I'm concerned, are totally tilted, against that. So we didn't get it. So we got the COVID. No problems.
Yeah, you just got COVID a few months ago.
Yeah. And so, that's the way it is. And we were taking a chance, let's face it. We didn't know for sure. But for me, that's just science. You look at the odds. You look at the statistics. And you look at the arguments that are being made in order to get that, and I didn't believe it. So
Did you ever get a response from those journals?
No, it won't. I finally sent it to a third journal. They did publish it. A little bit difficult there, but they did. It was a European journal, lesser known. So it's now in publication.
But the first two never responded to you?
No. They would never do that.
Wow.
That's the system we live in.
Yeah. It's really, really criminal. All right. So to shift gears a little bit and hopefully end on a bit more of a positive note, what are you really excited right now with developments in the world of nutrition research?
I'm not terribly excited on anything, but no, there's trends. Right now, there's the American College of Lifestyle Medicine that's kind of a little bit on the periphery. There's other organizations like called the Plant Nutrition Project. I've been the key speaker of both places. There's some of that, and there's another one I really like. There's another organization called the National Health Association. It used to be called the National Hygiene Society. It's the oldest one of all, 75 years old. They're out of Florida, and I spoke there, 40 years ago. They're coming up with a new convention in Cleveland in June. So you got these different nuggets. And then elsewhere in the world, we've got different organizations in a similar vein. I've probably spoken to 7 or 8 places where it's actually called the College of Lifestyle Medicine. I've been on of all things, on the Russian TV. TASS interviewed me, and then they wanted me to come back and be on the TV. So I was on the TV, the one TV station they have for the whole country, like 4 to 5 million people there. And China have done the same thing, a lot of countries. A lot of them have been there in person. And so all of a sudden I'm feeling a little sense of hope, because what I'm finding is that there's a lot of people. I mean, you learned your own sort of lesson in a way. Somehow people they're hearing this and they don't like that. I mean, who likes these stories? People are learning. They are learning. So I won't get to see it, but the word's got. I mean, you can't fool the people some of the people, some of the time. Whoever said that, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And I think we're at that stage. That and it's all about plants. That's where it is. And then the rest of the time enjoy your life. Eat the right thing. And the other thing people need to know. A lot of people will try this. We got these things called jump starts. Gwen did hers, and some others. My son have done theirs. And what happens in 10 days' time? People see the results. They're impressed, but they don't stay with it. And so I got a very close colleagues in Italy, where I've lectured a lot there, who have taken it a step further, and it's really good. This is what they did. So they do it for 10 days. They feel better. They fall back into what they did before. Well, it turns out that what they did, they started out with a group of people for 9 days. And then the 9th day, they're feeling good. And so, would you like to do it another 15 days? And at that point in time, their heads are in the right place. Yeah, okay. They're feeling good about it. So they do it for another 15 days. And then at the end of that 15 days, would you like to do it for another 15 days? They did it 4 times. Finally, now they're up to like 68 days, I think it is. What's that? That's almost 3 months. At that time, now their taste preferences have changed. And when they got to that point, oh yeah, now 100%, stay with it. So there's something here about the fact that we respond to things in the medical area, at least, or health area, according to preferences, or really kind of stuck in our brain and all the rest of it. But if we give ourselves enough time, which I would argue is like 1 to 2 months maybe, you get to that point, then you don't go back. I mean, I did it myself, my wife and I. I'm drinking milk all like crazy and all like that, and so we gradually did it over 10 years, because my wife is very good about that, because she's the one that was feeding our 5 kids, and she really got us all on board. We had to eat what she did, and she's the one who made me write the China study because I was complaining way back when. She said, "Why don't you just go out and tell the public?" And it was came with the New York Times story today. When that came out, the headline, you said Grand Prix or something like that. So Jesus, I don't know whether I want this here or not, all that kind of stuff. And so I was also almost inclined to go back and say, hey, you kind of overstated a bit. Don't be so dramatic. So I came home and talked to her. I said, do I contact the Times or Jane Bodie? Or I'll call Jane back and say, you kind of went a little bit too far. And she said that the newspaper had, changed the title a little bit. And so I said, what would I do? And she said, no. She said, tell the truth. So that's what it is. Whether they liked it or not, it had to go out there. So.
Yeah, I love that. Your wife has been such a important part of this journey for you and just supported you along the whole way. I had the honor of meeting her yesterday. She's just a delightful woman. So you both are really fortunate to have found each other, which is also a really cool story that we don't have time for right now. But you have been incredibly gracious with your time, Dr. Campbell. I really appreciate everything that you have done. I would not be plant-based if it weren't for you. The vegan gym would not exist without you. And I want to do everything I can to continue building on this movement that you have created. So just from the bottom of my heart, I really appreciate everything that you have contributed to not only my life, but this to the world as a whole.
Thank you.
So
still at it, trying to do the same thing. We've got, I think now about 9 of us in our family. We got 11 grandchildren. And now they're all coming on board and doing things, and it's kind of exciting.
Yeah, you have a wonderful family. So what is the best way that listeners can support your work?
We have a website called nutritioniststudies.org. Now that's with Cornell. It was a class I was teaching at Cornell until they yanked it out of the catalog. That's another story. But we came back, I put it online, and which was in the early stages. No one believed much in that working that way, but we did. We became #1 in the country, and Gwen is on our board now, and so that's been very rewarding. We got something now going in the Dominican Republic where my daughter is on the whole question concerning the environment. That is very exciting. It's Center for Nutrition Studies. They put it in my name. I wasn't too fancy for that, but it's got my name. That's there. People can sign on to it and get a certificate from Cornell.
Awesome.
It's just going over quite well.
Yeah, it's a hugely influential program. I've been through it. I know a lot of other people who have gone through it, and it's really impactful. So again, Dr. Campbell, thank you so much for all of your work. You also mentioned Gwen, who's sitting off to the side. So I want to give a special thank you to Gwen for setting up this interview, and looking forward to jumping into the Veg Fest right now. So thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.